Hi, my name's Rachel Goldwyn. I'm a freelance consultant, although was until recently with CARE, but haven't been involved with the CARE response actually in Syria. For Syria, sorry. The thing that I'm particularly interested in is around conflict sensitivity. You've mentioned obviously talking about protection issues. We talked about humanitarian principles, the difficult territory to negotiate there, and I'm really interested to know what people are doing around conflict sensitivity. And I recently was part of a team that completed a analysis of the conflict sensitivity of an NFI distribution coming out from Damascus, and as I've understood it, there hasn't really been any analysis of the cross-border work. I'm aware that there have been some small pockets of work done in specific host country situations, looking at host and refugee tensions, but not one that's sort of looked at the big picture across all three, via Damascus, cross-border, and then in third countries. I recall years back the DEC agencies doing the tsunami response in Sri Lanka all came together voluntarily. It wasn't the DEC didn't suggest it, but actually the agencies came together in Sri Lanka and said, look, let's look at the bigger picture here, the conflict sensitivity of this response. And there was a broad analysis that was done that was very insightful, very helpful. The agencies took that forward individually. The recommendations were also picked up by donors and became quite a strong mechanism for being able to create some change in that context. So I'm very interested. You have DEC agencies who are spanning all these three different ways of responding, and I think there's another deafening silence of what really ought to be known about the conflict sensitivity concerns across all three different forms of response, and what could be done collectively about that. That was my point.
Thank you very much, lady there with the yes, with the blue sweater.
Hi, my name is Mairead Collins from Christian Aid, Emergency Programme Officer for the Middle East. Just wanted to raise 2 points. Christian Aid is the only DEC partner, as far as I know, that's working in Iraq as part of the response, and I don't think it's been mentioned yet. Just to maybe fill people in a little bit on the situation there, they were receiving mid-August, when there was a massive influx, they were receiving 6% of the aid, while they had 9% of the refugee population for the region. There's over 60%, as you'd raised as well, regarding the other countries, over 60% of the refugees are urban-based. And while they're currently building 4 permanent camps, and I think there's only one of them is actually finished in Sulaymaniyah, there's massive pressure now coming on refugees to move to these camps, which may cause further problems along the line, because one of the ways in which the local government is encouraging this move is to ask local organisations providing aid, or NGOs in the region, to stop providing aid to the urban-based refugees as a way to push them to the camps, which will no doubt have some kind of knock-on effect. The other thing I just wanted to raise, because Annie, you mentioned how there's a lack of information around the disabled within the refugee population. One of our partners in Lebanon, who's receiving funding through our appeal, is LPHU, and they work with disabled within Lebanon, and they're currently doing a needs assessment of the disabled within the refugee community, particularly in the Bekaa Valley, and they're seeing both refugees who were born with disabilities, and then also quite a number within the Bekaa Valley region of people who've now disabilities because of the conflict. But this is an enormous challenge for them to try and create this database. And one of the things that they're coming up against is a lack of information sharing across some of the bigger organisations to share with them. So, thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hello, Robert Schofield, currently with Tear Fund, running the Syria programme. There's a huge amount in the report itself, and it's been fascinating also hearing your reflections and raising a whole host of other issues for us to consider. I'm sort of intrigued to try and boil this down to maybe 2 or 3 issues, perhaps Annie might respond to this, that you think we have to respond to as DEC agencies, so to try and prioritise what's absolutely critical. And you might well I guess, throw that back to DC members and say, what do you think? I mean, I from TIFON's perspective, if I could just throw something in, I think this corporate issue about how do you make decisions in these complex crises where there isn't an obvious immediate trigger like the Philippines is a good challenge for us to chew on. And I mean, I appreciated Jane, sharing that actually the situation with the Central African Republic is, there are lots of very interesting parallels there. So I think for us, that's something to really chew on and work out how we can address that.
Good. Would anyone like to address Jane's point? I mean, Jane has said to us that the principle of impartiality is being torn up and thrown out. That's a very big thing to say. Has anyone got a view on that? Because she's challenged us to try and respond to that, or not. You're brave. Good for you. Well done.
And maybe I'll take an advantage and ask a question at the same time. So Alima from Handicap International. I think I definitely agree with Jane that this is a very complicated context, and there are lots of questions around our principles and how we operate. And I think a lot of it for me comes back to the fact that we are operating in a protection context where ultimately it's not us as humanitarian actors that are responsible for bringing this to an end, and it puts us in a very, very complicated situation of trying to figure out how to provide the aid that you are providing in the best way possible. So in a very sort of microwave answering it, I think I wouldn't go so far as to say it's been torn up. I think what I would say, though, is that within the constraints which we're having, are we the right people to really push for political solutions or not as humanitarian actors? I think we are, as a community, trying, or at least members of this community are trying to do, in the areas we can reach, to be as impartial as possible and trying to diversify how we reach populations. And I think coming back to points made by different members on the panel, being innovative on how we do that, with challenges of our own as well. So, I mean, our own experience reflects a lot of what's in the report in terms of working with partners, building capacity of partners, but also working with new partners. That's something that came up perhaps a little bit less in the report. I think that there was a lot more focus on existing partnerships and getting them up for emergency response, but it's also looking at how can you work with new partners and a diverse range of partners and find innovative ways to work with them, particularly inside Syria, to try to maintain as much as you can where you can reach the impartiality of your action. It's not totally answering Jane's question, but that's one perspective. And I think for me, on a more, from a vulnerability perspective, for me that links to access of aid to older and disabled people, injured people, and those with chronic diseases. And it was one of the questions that was in the response review. There was some information in the actual report that does talk about it. For me, it links actually to Wendy's question on what are we trying to do to address non-camp refugees, because what we've recognized, and we work with one of the DEC agencies, Age UK, is that a lot of these particular groups are outside of the camps. And certainly one of the things we've done is developed a very strong outreach program, which I think CARE has also done quite solidly, and that's one of the ways where you can really try to get aid to the most in need. So impartiality, even within outside of the conflict zones as well, is to really reach those communities. And I think the question I sort of have is how can we work together as a humanitarian community, both DEC agencies and non-agencies, to really make that even more systematic and take the steps that have been taken in this first phase forward as a community, supporting each other to really make sure that aid does reach the most vulnerable.
Before we go to the panel, I just couldn't help scanning the room, and I have noticed a gentleman here. I do apologise for putting Raymond Apthorpe on the spot here. I'm not going to put him on the spot, but I should say to you that Raymond was the author of a report that came out, I believe, in 2000 about the Kosovo crisis, and actually ALNAP held a symposium in the year 2000 around that. And I do remember in the report, because I actually read it last night, so I know. I didn't remember it, but I've checked it. Raymond did make some comments and insights around issues around protection and impartiality. And I'm not asking you to make a comment, Roman, but maybe afterwards, if people want to talk to you, you are the institutional memory in the room when it comes to this kind of thing. So I just thought I'd say that. Panelists, please. We have questions on conflict sensitivity. We have questions about Iraq, priority issues for the DEC, and elderly people from Handicap International. David, do you want to have a bash at any of those?
A couple of points. I mean, I think it's a really important question you pose around conflict sensitivity analysis, and maybe that is something that we, boiling down practically, how do we as agencies strengthen that analysis of our operations? And for us, it's particularly around our partners and how we work with our partners. And it's part of two practical areas where we're currently supporting, through the ICRC, actually, the work they do on safer access. And they provide training on safer access, which includes an element of conflict sensitivity analysis at the point of delivery and distributions. The cross-border point is a very, very sensitive one, and I'd be really interested in your views. I might put one of my colleagues on the spot here who's here from the Red Cross, because that's something that there are contested areas around how we manage cross-border delivery in areas. And for us, we work with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which is a national organisation having to operate, negotiate access to both sides, and is delivering aid across lines. But the day-to-day reality is that's putting enormous risk that is having to be negotiating that access on a daily basis, and the perceptions around that that the Syrian Arab Red Crescent has had to deal with from all parties to the conflict has one of the reasons that's put many of their people in the front line. So I guess I'd like to sort of hear a bit more what practical analytical assessment tools do you think could be applied in the context like Syria, beyond these kind of work when actually the delivery on the ground is actually very few of us. It's through partner organisations. How can we strengthen those analytical tools of partners delivering in that kind of context with the 3 or 4 countries where there are so many contested areas needing exactly a much more sensitive approach? So I'd be interested, given your experience that you cited, what practical tools?
I don't think it's a tools. It's not an answer. I mean, it's about having the information and then being able to understand what really is going on the ground. And we've already said that there's very little knowledge about what's happening on the ground inside Syria. And so, for instance, SARC's access, perceptions of SARC, that there is a huge array of information. There's also there are other actors as well as SARC. So, I mean, I think what I've been involved with is had a look from the via Damascus route, but actually there is cross-border work. I think it's questionable how much cross-line is really happening, and I think very little is known about that cross-border work, what diversion rates there are, or all the kinds of things that are going on. We've talked a bit about the alternatives that could be through the diaspora network, kind of quite what the impacts of that are, whether that really is in fact scale-upable, or if that itself is dwindling. Because people are running out, they're kind of exhausted and they're turning their mobile phones off. I can't cope with hearing another call from person X inside to ask me for yet more money kind of scenario. So I mean, I think there's a huge lack of information, and then what conflict sensitivity does do is it helps us organise that and structure our thinking around it. I don't think it's a specific tool that has the answer, but it's kind of coming back to that politicisation question. I mean, this is an enormously politicised environment, and choice of even which route you go is a massive political question. Who you then partner with, all those kinds of things, part of that. And so what conflict sensitivity helps us do is force us to recognise those and place them in a way that we can make structured decisions about it, and perhaps then take on the advocacy around protection and those other kinds of questions.
Just a feedback to all of you that we have had a question from the online chat room about cross-border response, and it comes from Paul Harvey, and he's addressing it to me. And Wendy.
And others.
And others. Good. Everyone. That's a relief. Given the need for greater flexibility Wendy was talking about, is there anything that agencies could learn from cross-border responses in Ethiopia in the 80s? That's why it's us. And are any of the agencies engaging with diaspora, for instance, for monitoring aid within Syria? So maybe that's a good moment for you to come in.
I don't know that I can answer that one, John. I was in Ethiopia, but from 1990 to 2000, so it was just at the end of those cross-border operations. But I think, I think on that point, that's something maybe that some of the others can talk about in more detail, but it's around the, what are we doing in terms of negotiations? What are the limits also of what humanitarians can do? I mean, there's an interesting article in the Exchange written by Hugo Slim and Emanuela Chiara Gillard about the ethical and legal implications of cross-border operations, and they do look at the Ethiopia example and a couple of others. And I mean, they're not working, neither one of them is working in or specifically on Syria, but it's interesting to look at that analysis around what are the issues that you really do need to consider, and what are the implications. But I wanted to say a little bit about the conflict sensitivity, because I think this is an important point, and I just wanted to make you aware that a couple of years ago, the HPN published a network paper written by a group of 15 agencies, which is actually about applying conflict sensitivity in various types of crises, and it draws on the experience of these different agencies in different contexts. I mean, not in contexts necessarily like Syria, but I think there are some things to sort of review and look at, and these aren't. As Rachel, you said, it's not the tools really, but it does talk a bit about how, these analyses are conducted, what things one needs to look out for, and so it may be useful to some. Just on the impartiality issue, I mean, I wondered maybe if I can put Jane on the spot and ask her to explain that a little bit more. I mean, what you really meant, because what I was thinking of, again, in the context of an article written here anonymously, in fact, she calls herself a humanitarian activist, but started out as a human rights activist. And it's interesting because, they developed these networks. They were, very much in support of the uprising, but found themselves in a position of having to support the delivery of medical assistance because it was being pushed underground by medical workers being targeted. And this is a really crucial factor, I think, in this crisis, the direct targeting of medical, personnel and even patients, and the denial of this type of assistance in this crisis. And so, this network, which started out as a human rights network, became a relief network, let's say. I mean, definitely not impartial, definitely, part of the uprising. What do we call that? How do we work with that? They're providing absolutely essential assistance on the ground, but not impartial.
Jane, please.
Shall I answer that and then try and in one sentence pull together the other three?
My goodness, I'm glad you came.
I don't know. Well, I don't know. You may just think it's hopeless, but I think it's a good entry point. I mean, my point on impartiality is an unbelievably basic one. If impartiality means if you have a right to humanitarian assistance and protection, whoever you are, wherever you are within a particular crisis, then I think it's pretty obvious that is not happening. And I don't think, if I'd love it if somebody could actually sort of come up with an argument against that point, but I think that's the bottom line here. And we don't talk about it. That is the problem. And that's not blaming any particular party to the conflict. That is being scrupulously humanitarian. We don't talk about it. And yet we get on our high horses and talk about our principles at the drop of a hat. And I put myself very firmly in that camp. And I think that's my point. What is there that is within our gift that would perhaps help with that? I think ties to the conflict sensitivity point. There are very thoughtful, very detailed conversations that go on within Damascus about the aspects of the conflict, and you know, whether it's on the day-to-day basis of the micro access issues. Is it possible to go to X today or not? And also on the broader level. I imagine, although I don't know, because again of the very sensitive decision that we took to believe we could reach more people in more places through this opportunity to be in Damascus, I assume, because I trust my colleagues working in Turkey or wherever, that those similar discussions go on, but I don't know. So there's something that's getting in the way of us actually pulling people together to have that conversation, which ties into, you know, Robert's point about organisational decision making. You know, what is there that's stopping us, or stopping somebody stepping forward and saying, right, we will be the forum within which that collective discussion takes place. And that we're not doing that, and the impartiality point. To be honest, I don't think it's good enough that we just say we're trying. It's just not good enough, because we're letting people down. And somebody said to me back in March, I think this is the crisis where we will look back in 5 or 10 years and say, what on earth did we do, and how did we let people down so badly? And that comment from that individual was partly what shook Oxfam into making a different decision. And I think that's the point, Robert. I know how it happens in Oxfam. It's rarely as a result of a neat, thoughtful process. It's about, you know, we all poddle along and then somebody says something like that. And yeah, and it was somebody saying that to us that made us go, I think you're possibly right. And so maybe that's the moment we need somehow collectively.
Good, make a note of that. That's a really important point. Paul's question's just got me thinking. 10 seconds from me on this. I was actually working cross-border in Ethiopia and Eritrea in the 80s. I think the big difference then was, I suppose, Paul, that I felt quite safe going across with the EPLF and era into Eritrea, even though there's a war going on. And there was a big trench right in the middle of Eritrea in those days, and the Ethiopian army were on one side and we were on the other. And I think it's a very different situation in Syria. But I will think about that a little bit more. It's an interesting question. Please, questions, more. Sir, please.
Thank you very much. Alex Sim, I work for I2I Research. I'd be interested to hear more about access. You talk about access being a problem. We currently have a research team operating in Syria, and it's interesting to see that sort of obviously there's areas of conflict that we can't get our teams into, and then there's the coastal sort of areas that are still under strong regime control. But there's also areas of like Raqqa, which is becoming more and more sort of in control of religious extremist groups. So I'd be interested to hear from the panel more about sort of when you talk about access. So access from my point of view is actually, can I get a team in there? But maybe there's sort of government issues that you have to go through, and so on.
Alex, could you just repeat who you said you worked for? I didn't quite catch that.
It's a company called I2I Research, and my director's also here as well, which I'll point out.
I2I Research, okay, great.
I'm happy to give a little bit more background on what we do in the wings.
Okay, good. Please.
I have actually two questions. The first one is regarding, you have talked about difficulties in scaling up the response to this emergency and in assessing the needs of the population. So my question is, what kind of tools or how have you collected information on these needs from the population in order to plan the extent of the scaling up? I mean, have you used written reports from, for example, local organization, or, for example, new media to collect information directly from the population, as it has happened, for example, in the Haiti earthquake response, with a shady, for example, so crisis mapping. And the second question is regarding, you have talked about also local people helping other local people, and we know that local communities most of the time the first responder in case of disaster or emergency. So my question is, how have you tried to avoid the application of the efforts? So how have you tried to coordinate your efforts and activities with one of the population on the ground?
Brilliant, thank you. We'll take one more question, if sir, please.
Thank you, Johan Elderberg from World Vision. One related question on the point of lack of availability of data in this response. If you look at, I guess, across the three countries of Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, what I found, having been in and out quite a bit over the last 2 years now, is that that's very true, that there isn't that much in terms of data as one would like, which in the case of Syria, of course, security issue is quite big, but the issue seems also to exist quite a bit in Lebanon and Jordan. And security issues are also there, but not nearly as difficult as they are in Syria. So we started thinking about why is this, and one proposition that was put to me in Lebanon on this from an organization there was that the reason for one reason for lack of data is that this is turning into a long-term response, but it's been seen and managed as a short-term response on repeat. Where we've had our 6 months programs, and then we've had another 6 months program, and then we've done that for the last couple of years, which that hasn't provided an incentive for anyone to actually do any type of substantial data collection, because we've all been hoping or wishing at least that we will be out of there in the next few months anyways. Would the panel agree with that? And if so, or if not, how do we fix it?
Brilliant, thank you. So there's questions around access, needs assessment, and lack of data. Who would like to?
Just say something about David. What I was referring to repeatedly on access is very linked to security, and that there are huge parts of the country where access is extremely problematic. Practically on a daily basis, access is negotiated, and that is about getting the authority from relevant actors to cross numerous checkpoints and roadblocks. I'll just give one example of a recent Red Cross convoy, which involves 15-truck convoy that left Damascus and didn't even leave Damascus area, and involved 60 road checkpoints, and then was turned back before reaching the point of delivery. That's what I mean. And in areas from our situation reports, it's rural Damascus, Raqqa, and Aleppo, and Idlib, and Homs, which are the most challenging. But you're quite right. There are areas where access is not problematic, but it's absolutely interlinked with negotiating with numerous non-state actors. The reports tell us of anything up to 1,000 non-state actors, and sometimes that can be a checkpoint of just a few individuals. Sometimes it can be a recognised warring party, but it is the endless information reports we receive is that is a daily negotiation of access, where the decision makers and who are responsible for the humanitarian aid workers on the ground have to determine, is it safe to pass that passage and to deploy our humanitarian aid workers on the front line in that context. And it is that huge challenge, as I've referred to SARC, our partner, that has been the day-to-day reality of negotiating access for them and their humanitarian aid workers and volunteers, that has cost them, a number of them, either their lives or being detained at the point of negotiating access. So it's that practical day-to-day reality. And maybe that does tie into that conflict analysis that needs to be much richer and deeper and a little bit more informed for us as humanitarian actors.
Jane, please.
I mean, David said it on access, so I won't repeat that. On the how is information gathered, a whole raft of means really, and all the ones you mentioned, yes, they have been used. I think the the question though is, has that been mapped out as a, you know, sort of regular commitment to information gathering and updating? And I think it's that cohesion and coherence which isn't yet right. And I think I would agree. I think a lot of that is quite possibly because the sort of the time frame within which we're working, in a way it feels as though we haven't really embraced the fact that this could be going on for an awful lot longer. And so I like your I mean I don't, but I mean I think it's a very apt description, a short-term response on repeat. I would agree with you. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add much to what David and Jane have already said, except just to say that, I mean, there are a couple of interesting articles in the Exchange around needs assessment, and there is the Syria Needs Assessment Project. And not working on the ground myself and not being directly involved, it would be interesting to know from you, you know, how useful some of these initiatives are. I mean, exploring different ways of getting information. I mean, that also started with the J-Rounds initiative, I think. But trying to think of innovative ways to, or maybe not that innovative, but just making use of any particular way that you can to bring together information from different sources and triangulate that and try to make sense of it. So it sounds to me as if there are some of these initiatives going on. I know the Child Protection Working Group, again, they've talked about their findings in this issue of the Exchange, but trying to, you know, bring together through a variety of means, you know, an indication of at least what's going on in these areas. But I'm certainly not in a position to answer that from any experience on the ground.
So, do you want to?
It's a response a little bit more on the impartiality question, but only if
Yeah, well, you can have the last word, so just say who you are, please. Thank you.
My name's Pete Garrett. I work for British Red Cross, and I lead our international emergency response teams. I think if I look from a Red Cross perspective, the hundreds of millions that we are putting into Syria, which is far, far in excess of what we're able to put into Jordan and Lebanon, is one aspect to, I think, challenge the sort of the impartiality issue. But if I step back from that and look at a higher level, I would agree with you. Are we doing everything we can as humanitarian agencies within the parameters in which we are operating within Syria? Different agencies will take a view on that. I believe we pretty much are. Given that there are a multiplicity of different delivery options being explored, and I think the point about conflict sensitivity analysis and cross-border, cross-line, third country, etc., those different options are being pursued if you looked collectively across all of the different agencies involved. I think we also sometimes under and overestimate our importance as humanitarian agencies. We are important to the people that we're helping on a day-by-day basis. There is no question about that, and perhaps we underestimate that. I think we overestimate our ability to really change at a macro level this context. Unless we were prepared perhaps to consider, and this is probably a terrible term, but the nuclear button option of ceasing all humanitarian activity in Syria to make one hell of an advocacy point. But that's for individual agencies to wrestle with, and I, certainly from a Red Cross perspective, we're not at that point. And I think we feel that we have to continue chipping away day by day in the negotiation, and we must be stronger on advocacy, and I think that's really important, and that's why the movement call, you know, I was so pleased to see that we got to that point. As David said earlier, it's a bit relatively unusual for us to be so public on that, and I'm pleased that we have spoken out. So that's sort of chipping away day by day, because we don't yet feel that we can abandon people and not yet prepared to incur all of the costs that would come with leaving that situation and standing back in order to make, you know, a very big point. So I recognise the huge dilemma we're all faced with, and I think the sort of chipping away at it is the position that we're in, and I think probably we are making the best of a terrible situation.
Well, I think that's a very balanced and pragmatic way to end the discussion. We are reaching the end of our time here. I mean, obviously, the whole situation is deeply troubling. it's very, very grave, and I think some of the really big fundamental questions about the identity of the humanitarian community, about who we are and what we do, are emerging as a result. So we will leave it there. I should say, we have a request. Can all participants be encouraged to consult the Syria Learning and Evaluation portal and get in touch with ALNAP if they have any useful resources that they can contribute to collective learning? You can do this either directly or through the portal. And Jane, maybe if you could just pass me this, this one here.
Oh, okay.
It's on the portal. I just wanted to double check. Jane has recommended this particular report, but it is on the portal. I think it also is important to say that the reports, the DEC summary reports, are outside in the lobby now, so you can each you can get one. And there's another report. Yet another report. There's lots of reports going down here. Can you say which report this is?
Do you want to sanctions issues for banks and humanitarian agencies? Do you want me just to explain that? The DEC, give me a help, thank you. The DEC has worked with the British Bankers Association, just to highlight just one small other element in this. Getting money into Syria is enormously difficult. And the BBA, the DEC and Freshfields, the solicitor, the law firm, have produced this document, which will be on our website. We could even put it on the portal if that would be good.
I insist you put it on the portal.
Good. We have a few copies outside, and I do recommend it to you. It's very practical advice, a discussion about the challenges, the practical challenges of getting aid, money. We're talking about money here, really, and some practical advice on what you need to do.
And this is nothing to do with the Royal Bank of Scotland, is it?
Nothing to do with the Royal Bank of Scotland.
Just
The British Bankers,
okay,
the British Bankers Association.
Okay,
BBA.
we're safe. Good. I would like to thank all of our panellists really for their openness and their insights. I think it's been really, very, very interesting and enlightening indeed. So thank you to David, thank you to Wendy, thank you to Jane, and I think on this particular occasion a special thank you for Annie for stepping in at 5 seconds notice and giving us a great presentation. Thank you.